So, back in early 2026, a brand new set of university regulations designed to fight caste discrimination dropped, and wow, it set off a huge firestorm across the country. On one side, you had people calling it a long overdue step towards justice. On the other, critics were calling it a dangerous overreach. So, what's really at the heart of this huge divide? Let's dive in. And right away, you could feel this one central fear start to bubble up across social media and on the streets. Protests kicked off. Some officials even resigned, and pretty soon the hashtag UGC rollback was trending everywhere. So what is the deal with these new rules? What's in them that's causing such an uproar? Okay, so first things first, let's really look at how people reacted right out of the gate to these new regulations from the University Grants Commission, the UGC. The opposition was loud, it was organized, and it spread like wildfire, from campus protests to a full-blown social media campaign.
You see, a lot of the backlash was all about this idea that the rules were totally one-sided, that they would unfairly target students from the general category. And a huge sticking point was that an earlier draft of these rules had a penalty for false complaints, but that was removed. So this led to this massive fear that the whole system could be misused and end up creating even deeper divisions instead of healing them.
All right, to really get to the bottom of this whole thing, we've got to look past the social media hashtags and the headlines. We need to dig into what these rules actually say and how they're different from what we had before.
So these officially came out on January 13th, 2026. And get this, they apply to every single higher education institution in the country. The stated goal? Super ambitious, promoting total equity and inclusion. But here's the thing you need to know. This isn't the first time they've tried this. These rules are actually a replacement for a much older, kind of forgotten set of regulations from back in 2012.
And this is the really crucial part. Every single university is now required to build this whole formal system. First, you've got the Equal Opportunity Center, which handles the big picture policy stuff. Then there's a 10-member equity committee that has to look into complaints fast, within 15 days. And they even have these mobile equity squads to proactively keep an eye on things around campus. It's a whole system, complete with a 24-hour helpline.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. You've got to see the huge difference between the old rules and the new ones. It's basically a shift from a friendly suggestion to a strict order. Back in 2012, the rules were just advice. Universities could just ignore them, no problem. But the 2026 regulations, they have real teeth. The UGC can now actually cut off funding and grants if institutions don't comply. And that switch from voluntary to mandatory is a huge reason why people are so passionate on both sides of this.
But rules like this don't just pop up out of nowhere. They're born from history, and in this case, a really painful and public history of caste discrimination on university campuses.
Yeah, this timeline really lays it all out. It's so clear. After the heartbreaking deaths of Rohit Vimala and Dr. Payal Tadvi, their mothers refused to stay silent. They took their fight all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that those old 2012 rules just weren't working. And the court agreed. They said any new rules had to be more than just symbolic gestures. That push from the highest court is what directly led to the powerful, enforceable rules we're talking about today.
But the fight over these rules isn't just about what's written on the page. It actually opens up a much deeper debate that's been happening in academic circles for years about what caste on campus really looks like, and what's the best way to tackle it. And this is probably the biggest question at the heart of the debate. Are these rules fixing the right problem? I mean, is discrimination just about a few bad people's behavior, or is it something bigger, something baked into the system itself?
Professor Latika Gupta, for one, thinks these rules kind of miss the mark. She argues that the real problem is structural. She talks about the schooling divide, how some students show up to university with advantages from their schooling, and that gap in skills gets wrongly blamed on caste. She's saying the system itself is set up to create inequality, and you can't fix that by just policing bad behavior.
But then you have the other side of the coin. Professor Satish Deshpande thinks there's a huge value in just being able to name the problem out loud. He says that for too long, discrimination was something people just didn't talk about. So for him, this law is powerful because it makes it impossible to pretend the problem doesn't exist. It gives people a goal to work towards, even if it's not a perfect solution.
Okay, so the next big point of debate is, who exactly are these rules designed to protect? By putting everyone under one big umbrella, are you helping, or are you actually making things more confusing?
So what the rules do is they take several different groups, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, even people from economically weaker sections and those with disabilities,
and they lump them all together under this single idea of equity. And as you can imagine, people have very different feelings about whether that's a good idea or not.
Professor Gupta is definitely not a fan of this. She says you just can't equate something like a physical disability with the kind of discrimination that comes from caste, or that facing challenges because of poverty is the same thing. To her, lumping them together isn't just watering down the issue. She calls it a gross violation. Professor Deshpande, though, he looks at it from a more practical, legal perspective. He basically says, look, when you're writing a law, you have to cast a wide net to include anyone who could be discriminated against. He argues the real question isn't about the wording, but about how it's actually going to work in the real world.
And all this brings us right back to where we started, to that big fear that really drove the whole #UGC rollback campaign, the fear that these rules will be misused.
Here again, Professor Deshpande brings in some historical perspective. He points out that this isn't a new argument. He says, hey, whenever a law comes along to help a weaker section of society, the very first thing you hear is, it's going to be misused. He sees a lot of the protest as a reaction from people whose privilege is being challenged for the first time, a kind of entitlement being violated.
So, you've heard all these different angles, all these really complex arguments. So what's the bottom line? When all is said and done, are these new regulations actually going to make a difference?
Well, as you can see, the experts are all over the map on this one. You've got Professor Gupta, who's pretty pessimistic, saying these rules just paper over the real systemic problems. Then there's a more cautious take from former Vice Chancellor Furqan Kamar, who's worried they'll just be words on a page without real commitment. And then you have Professor Deshpande, who's more hopeful, seeing them as a flawed but really important starting point, a new tool for people to use in the fight for justice.
And in the end, this whole debate around the UGC's rules really makes us ask a huge question. How does real change even happen? You can have a new rulebook, a new framework, but the real challenge is changing those deep-seated prejudices that, as Professor Gupta says, are constitutive. They're part of who we are from a young age. So can a committee truly change a culture? That's the big question that's still hanging in the air. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.